Out of the 4,376 games released for the PlayStation 2, only a tiny handful run at a resolution of 240p. What was once the dominant resolution for console gaming, from the time of the Famicom all the way to the N64, old reliable 240p was eventually swept under the rug by the PS2 and friends, to make way for a shiny range of new resolutions that hovered around 640 by 480. This bump in pixel counts, thanks to the more powerful hardware, allowed for developers to insert about twice as much detail into any given scene and provided players with a much greater sense of visual clarity. And after about 15 years of 240p, it was happy days, with everybody eager to move on to a larger canvas of pixels that seemed crystal clear by comparison. That is, everybody except for director Fumito Ueda. Released in 2001, when 480p was well in swing thanks to the Dreamcast, Eco runs at a crunchy resolution of 512 by 224, which has more in common with the PS1 than the PS2. Beginning its development as a PS1 exclusive back in 1998, Ueda's graphical vision for the game soon became too big for the boots of the aging PlayStation hardware. Almost everything was scrapped before Eco was reborn as a PS2 game. Everything except for that low resolution. The world of Eco is beautiful in its own unique and fuzzy way. There's a soft realism to the low poly characters and their animations. Surface textures have a blotchy, impressionistic quality. Wispy transparencies are both blocky and ethereal, and the bloom of the sun feels overwhelming on such a small grid of pixels. In a 2004 GDC talk, Ueda mentions how that low resolution was an intentional artistic choice to hide various rendering tricks in the pursuit of reality. That bold, anachronistic choice is one of my favorite things about Eco, and in a backwards sort of way, that low resolution only serves to make the game feel even more timeless. A decade later, Eco would be re-released in 1080p for the PS3, and despite its modest little polygons and simple textures now laid bare under the magnifying glass of high resolution, I'd say it's still a very pretty looking game. But something is lost. Everything in the world of Eco was built from day one to be seen at 240p. And boosting it to such a high resolution significantly alters that original artistic vision. The seams are more obvious, the world feels slightly more artificial, and each scene looks less cohesive. That feeling of looking into another world through a lens specifically crafted to showcase it at its best is no longer there. The clarity is nice, but to my eyes I'm not sure it's worth the trade-off of deviating from that original surreal look. To use another medium as an analogy, Eco in 240p is a bit like watching an old, low-budget horror movie on VHS. The fuzz and grain of an old tape often works in the film's favour, helping to hide smudgy makeup, painted backdrops, or the ass crack of a guy in a rubber suit. Watching a good 4K restoration of a movie like that can be a nice peek behind the curtain to see how all of those practical effects were done on a shoestring budget. But that previously convincing sense of blurry reality just isn't there anymore. And pretty often, upscaling a game which was only ever meant to be seen in its original resolution can have that exact same illusion-shattering effect. While older PC games were typically made with multiple resolutions and future-proofing in mind, old console exclusives were more or less always created to look their best at a fixed resolution. Don't get me wrong, I'm not some kind of Amish video game Luddite who wants everything to return to 240p. Instead, what I'm really churning the butter for is this idea that a lot of pre-HD console games look their best at their original intended resolution, whether that's 240p, 480p, or anything in between. The professional hot dog eaters from various forums will be quick to point out that no retro experience is complete without the glowing scan lines of a CRT. And for a lot of old games, I'm inclined to agree. But with the prices of those bulky, deteriorating old tubes slowly creeping up, I'll stick to talking about modern flat panels for this one. What looks good and what doesn't is a very subjective thing. But for now, I just want you to bear with me on the idea that for a lot of these older games, clearer is not necessarily always better. If I had to pick any major console that benefits the least from internal upscaling, it would be the PlayStation 1. While an amazing and affordable piece of kit for the time with fast and easy to manage 3D rendering, the PS1 suffered from a number of unfortunate quirks which only become more noticeable with emulator upscaling. The most famous of the bunch being the system's trademark affine texture warping. Polygons and textures jiggle and warp all over the place thanks to the system's lack of a Z buffer. This is still noticeable at 240p, but crank up the res and things can look positively underwater at times. Low resolution 2D backgrounds with 3D models walking around on top of them is another classic characteristic of the PS1's library. And on a CRT with everything perfectly blurred together, some of these games can look years ahead of their time. While the same images will look significantly more pixelated on a flat panel, everything can still hang together nicely at native res or with a quality scanline filter. But things get ugly as soon as we boost the resolution of those characters. The 3D models scale up, but the backgrounds stay the same. There's an obvious mismatch now, and that illusion of these little guys living on a pre-rendered image suddenly falls apart. And for many of these games, the backgrounds are a lot more detailed than the field models, and when you see them up close, it can be a real jump scare. But thanks to the magic wand of emulation, we don't have to suffer through heavy dithering, texture warping, or jagged aliasing anymore. PGXP can hold those wobbling polygons still. True color rendering eliminates dithering entirely, without introducing ugly banding. And downsampling can upscale 3D assets, then soften them out while keeping the glue of 240p intact. You can create a look for these games that remains relatively true to the original vision, while smoothing over the nastier smudges that developers probably wouldn't have wanted in the first place. And yet, sometimes those imperfections can feel like an essential part of the experience. Silent Hill 1 without that industrial-looking dither pattern and ghoulish texture warping makes a game that should look grimy and off-putting a little bit too clean. Seeing Crash Bandicoot exactly as it appeared in 1996 makes Naughty Dog's mastery of the hardware all the more impressive. I am willing to chalk a little of this up to nostalgia, and most of the PS1's library does look great with sensible enhancements that still keep the 240p output intact. Typically, all I'll do is enable PGXP and true color rendering, then keep the rest vanilla. So tweak and fiddle to your heart's content, but don't forget to try that original look too. You might just like it the best. The N64 is a lot less cut and dry. With its 64-bit reality coprocessor, 3D graphics feel remarkably more solid. Characters have significantly higher polygon counts, textures mostly behave themselves now thanks to the system's built-in depth buffer, and while 2D and 3D elements still mix and mingle, there's less of a reliance on pre-rendered backgrounds. Compared to other 5th gen consoles, I don't mind the look of upscaled N64 games too much. As a bit of a PlayStation nut back in the day, Project 64 or the Wii Virtual Console running at an internal 480p was how I originally saw many of these games. Over time though, I've really come to appreciate that smeary, anti-aliased look of real N64 hardware. There's a nice soft quality to it that gives the system a visual identity of its own, next to the sharp pixels of the Saturn and PlayStation. I think the N64 can really go either way. A clean and simple game with modest geometry and texture work like Mario 64 or Kirby can look nice at higher resolution. But for graphically ambitious late-gen titles like Conker's Bad Fur Day or Sin and Punishment, I think you do need the smoke and mirrors of native resolution. Downsampling actually makes a whole lot of sense for N64 games, seeing as the system's VI filters already have that blurry look to begin with. It's a nice way to sneak some more visibility in, and unlike the downsampling on the PS1, it really doesn't disturb the intended look of the system. But with traditional upscaling, things can get ugly very quickly, so I generally don't use it. High definition can reveal a lot of asset pop-in. It can make those blurry vomit textures stand out in a harsh way. Complex effects like waves look a lot more primitive, and on the most accurate PC emulators, it'll expose a surprising amount of Z-fighting. But then again, a game like Perfect Dark, which is way too complex and detailed for tiny old 240p, can greatly benefit from a bit of a res bump just for the sake of seeing what the hell you're looking at. N64 games can feel so close to having that scalable quality that a lot of old PC games and 6th gen titles have. That's why my favourite way to enjoy many of these games is through a nice faithful remaster, of which there are many. Give these games a little love and care without being too heavy-handed on the upgrades, and the results can be pretty sweet.
Oh, just what I needed.
Now we've come to the 6th generation of consoles, the land of 480i and 480p. The leap in graphical fidelity from 5th gen to 6th gen was enormous. There's a night and day difference between these generations that we're unlikely to ever see again. And in terms of pure aesthetics, this is my favourite time in games history. developers went wild with the power of these new consoles, but still had to rein in their ambitions, which ultimately kept things looking pleasantly gamey. There's no uncanny valley here like we'd see in the following generations, and in-house engines were still common, which led to less homogenization and a smorgasbord of unique visual styles. When I close my eyes and think of video games, these are the worlds that pop into my head. It's a generation chock full of games that received great HD remasters, solid PC versions, or emulate so smoothly that keeping your original systems hooked up can feel like a waste of time. It's also an era of games where most people would be happy to just upscale. And why not? Many of these games look phenomenal in high definition. The multitude of cel-shaded games from this time can appear like they were always destined for high definition gaming. The Dreamcast's library of clean, colourful games intended for a VGA signal might make you shed a tear for a time when games weren't bloated with a million different effects and filters. And Xbox games, many of which were developed in tandem with a high-res PC version, just look right at home in HD, especially for titles with a built-in widescreen mode. Upscaling will always bring one or two flaws along for the ride, like HUD and text elements looking blurrier than the game world, clipping and pop-in may seem more obvious, and certain objects that were never meant to be seen in such detail may be distractingly ugly. A lot of people won't even notice these pimples, or if they do, they'll happily take it as a trade-off for that increased clarity. A solid compromise for official HD ports that I'd love to see more of is the ability to switch that original look on or off, even on console. Of all the people that bought Shenmue HD, I'm sure there's a good amount of weirdos like myself who loved that ability to play it in 4.3 480p like it was 1999. I like to play a lot of games from this era in HD as well. But there are a lot of outliers. Resident Evil 4, Eco, Remake, MGS2, Final Fantasy X, Metroid Prime, Onimusha, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne, and of course the Silent Hill games. All games I've played in HD that I just prefer the original jagged look of. I love the time travel aspect of seeing these games exactly as they were meant to run, with or without the CRT, and I really don't mind most of the aliasing that comes with it. Trying to put these very subjective thoughts onto a topic all about visuals has been difficult. I've tried to avoid the phrase, "there's just something about it," but maybe that's a mistake. I think there is just something about it, and trying to convey that to you through my own descriptions and comparison shots won't ever be as powerful as you just picking up the controller and playing these games in standard definition for yourself. So check it out. Pick an old game you love that you've been playing in HD for years or only ever experienced through upscaled emulation. Play it on a CRT or see it in all its pixelated glory on a modern screen. Fiddle with some extra options if you wish, but always keep that original output resolution intact. Play a great game for a few minutes and you'll sink right into the world these developers created for you. And pretty soon, high definition will be the furthest thing from your mind.